There was a woman in Hallow Creek who dragged a dead man's trunk through 3 miles of swamp, and the whole town watched her do it. They did not help her. They did not even move out of her way. They stood on the wooden walkway in front of Tatum's dry goods store, and they watched, and some of them laughed, and one man, we won't say who, called out that she ought to leave it where she found it, because anything that came out of Harlan's bog came out cursed. She did not stop. She did not look up. She just kept pulling. Her name was Selah Mourne. She was 22 years old, and she had arrived in Hallow Creek 11 days prior with a canvas bag over one shoulder, a worn leather satchel over the other, and exactly $4.30 to her name. She had no family left, no address to return to, no one who was expecting her anywhere in the world. What she had was a pair of steady hands, a knowledge of bookbinding that most people in 1887 had never thought to value, and a bone-handled awl that had belonged to her teacher. A small, precise instrument with a brass collar and a point so fine it could split a horsehair if you aimed it right. The awl had belonged to a man named Bernard Cray. He had spent 40 years binding ledgers, Bibles, land deeds, and legal documents for anyone in the county who needed them. He had taken Selah on as an apprentice when she was 14, after her mother died, and her father's brother made it clear that a niece was a burden he had not agreed to carry. Bernard Cray had taught her how to punch holes in paper without tearing it, how to choose thread by the weight of the paper and not the look of the thread, how to press a cover flat so it would never warp. He had also taught her, without meaning to, how to notice things, how to look at an object and understand its structure, its age, its purpose, and what it was hiding. Bernard Cray died in the spring of 1887. He left her the awl and his blessing. He left everything else to a nephew in Ohio who sold the bindery before the body was cold. Selah had nowhere to go. She had heard there was work in Hallow Creek, a land office, a county clerk, the kind of bureaucratic machinery that needed someone who could keep records in order. She came on the stage. She asked about the work. The land office had already hired someone. The county clerk said he had no need of a bookbinder. A woman at the hotel said she might try the schoolhouse, because the school mistress had left in March and nobody had replaced her yet. But when Selah went to ask, the man who managed the school board, a wide, pale man named Aldous Greer, who wore a silver watch chain even on days that didn't call for one, told her they were looking for someone with a proper certificate, and he said it in the tone of a man who has decided something before the conversation started. That was day 3. By day 6, she was mending leather for the saddle maker for 50 cents a day, which was enough to pay for her room at the boarding house. But not enough to save anything, and not the kind of work that would last once the saddle maker's apprentice came back from his mother's place in the next county over. On day 8, she heard about the trunk. It came up at supper, the way things do in a boarding house, sideways, in the middle of a sentence about something else. The woman, across the table a school teacher's widow, named Patsy Lorne, mentioned that the old Rennick property out past the bog had been sitting empty since Clement Rennick died intestate in 1882, and that 2 men had gone out there in the summer to see about salvaging the timber, and that they'd found a trunk in the bog itself, half submerged in the black water, at the edge of the property, and they'd decided it wasn't worth the trouble of dragging out. What kind of trunk? Selah asked. Patsy Lorne looked at her the way people look at someone who has asked the wrong question. A bog trunk, she said, a ruined one. But Selah had a habit, she had learned it from Bernard, of not accepting the first description of a thing. She asked where exactly the bog was. She asked how far in the trunk had been. She asked who the 2 men were. Patsy told her, mostly because Selah asked quietly and with the specific patience of someone who is not going to stop. The next morning, Selah borrowed a coil of rope from the saddle maker and walked 3 miles out to Harlan's bog now. You have to understand something about that trunk before we go any further. You have to understand what it looked like to the 2 men who found it and why they left it. It was dark with water. It was half buried in silt. The leather straps had rotted away on one side and the brass hinges had gone green. There was moss on the lid. It smelled, and we are being honest here. It smelled like the bottom of the earth. There was no obvious reason to want it. There was no obvious reason to believe it contained anything worth recovering. But Selah Mourne looked at that trunk in the water, and she noticed 2 things that the other 2 men had not. The first was the corner joints. They were hand-cut dovetails, the kind that took a skilled craftsman the better part of a day to fit properly. Nobody made trunks with hand-cut dovetails for hauling ordinary goods. You made them that way for things you meant to last, for things you meant to protect. The second was the weight. She could see, By the way the silt had settled around the base, that one end sat lower than the other. Not because it had sunk unevenly, but because what was inside was heavier on one side. She tied the rope around it. She pulled. It took her 4 hours. We want you to sit with that number for a moment. 4 hours. The rope cut into her palms. She lost her left boot in the mud at the 40-minute mark and had to fish it out by feel. She moved the trunk 6 inches at a time, stopping to reposition the rope, to find higher ground for her feet, to rest her arms. Twice she thought she had it, and the mud took it back. The second time, she sat down in the grass at the edge of the bog, and she looked at her hands and she breathed, and then she stood up and went back in. She got it out. By the time she was pulling it down the road toward Hallow Creek, people had started to notice. A boy on a fence post. A woman hanging washing. And then, as she got closer to the main street, a small audience of grown adults, who should have known better than to stand there with their arms folded, watching a young woman drag a swamp-soaked trunk across the dirt road like it was entertainment. Someone said she was touched. Someone said she'd wasted her morning. The man from the dry goods store, the one who called it cursed, said it loud enough for her to hear. Selah did not answer any of them. She had learned that too from Bernard. You don't argue with someone who has already decided what they're looking at. You just finish what you came to do. She got the trunk to the boarding house. She got it into the back room that Patsy Lorne, who was surprised and a little appalled and ultimately too curious to say no, allowed her to use. She got it up on a table. She found a cloth and she began to clean the outside. The lock was seized. She had expected that. She worked it for an hour with the awl and a piece of wire she had straightened from a broken lamp. The same way Bernard had taught her to open the old ledgers that arrived at the bindery with their clasps corroded shut. He had told her once that every locked thing wants to be opened. It just needs someone patient enough to ask correctly. The lock gave. She opened the lid, and what she actually found in that trunk at the bottom of Harlan's bog, in a box that 2 men had left for dead, was not what anyone in Hallow Creek would have expected. There were books, not ordinary books, 7 bound volumes, wrapped in oilcloth, the oilcloth itself sealed with wax at the seams. The kind of preparation you made when you expected the thing inside to be submerged, or caught in rain, or otherwise threatened by water. The kind of preparation a person made deliberately, with knowledge and intent. She unwrapped them carefully. The oilcloth had done its job. The books inside were dry. The covers were worn but intact. And as she began to turn the pages of the first one, she understood what she was looking at. They were ledgers, but not the public kind. The first 3 volumes were accounts, columns of dates and names and numbers, written in a hand she did not yet recognize, covering a span of years from 1871 to 1881. Payments made and received, property valuations. A series of transactions involving land parcels whose names she recognized from the county, parcels that, as far as the public record went, had transferred hands through standard sales or court-ordered settlements. But these numbers did not match. In the public record, a parcel called the Sutter Quarter had been valued at $40 and sold at auction in 1876 to satisfy a debt. In this ledger, the same parcel appeared valued at $220, with the difference $180, distributed across 4 names in 4 equal amounts. On the same day the auction was recorded. 4 names. The 4th was Aldous Greer. We will ask you to hold on to that name, because it comes back. The next 3 volumes were correspondence. Copies, written in the same hand, of letters sent and received over the same decade. They were careful letters, precise letters, the kind written by someone who knew that letters could be used against you and had tried to write around that danger without quite managing it. There were references to the arrangement and the previous understanding, and the matter we discussed in September. There were also, in 3 of the letters, explicit references to specific parcels, specific amounts, and specific officials who had facilitated transfers that should not have gone the way they went. The 7th volume was different. It was not a ledger, and it was not correspondence. It was a journal, and the handwriting was smaller and more hurried, the ink occasionally smeared as if the writer had been working fast or in poor light. It began in January of 1880, and it ended, abruptly, in August of 1881. The last entry read, "I have made copies of everything. I am putting them somewhere safe. If something happens to me, whoever finds this will understand what to do." The journal belonged to a man named Clement Rennick, the man who had died intestate in 1882, the man whose property sat empty at the edge of Harlan's bog. Selah sat in that back room for a long time after she finished reading. The candle had burned down to a stub. The boarding house was quiet. Outside, Hallow Creek was going about its evening in the ordinary way. Horses, voices, the faint sound of music from the saloon 2 streets over. None of it sounded quite real. She thought about Bernard Cray. She thought about how he had told her, more than once, that a book was only as honest as the person who kept it, but that an honest book, kept honestly, was the most powerful thing in the world. It could outlast a man. It could outlast a lie. It could sit in the mud at the bottom of a bog for 6 years and still tell the truth when someone finally opened it. She thought about the Sutter Quarter. She thought about the other parcels. There were 9 of them, in total, across the 3 ledger volumes. And she tried to calculate in her head what the difference between the recorded valuations and the actual valuations amounted to. She got to somewhere north of $2,000 before she lost count. She thought about who had known about those parcels, who had been in a position to arrange the transfers, who had signed the relevant documents. Aldous Greer was the county land assessor from 1870 to 1883, before he became the school board manager. She had not known that when she walked into his office on day 3. She knew it now. In the morning, she went to the office of a man named Howard Quell. Howard Quell was not a lawyer in the formal sense. Hallow Creek was too small for a full-time attorney. But he was a notary and a land agent, and a man who had, by the account of several people Selah had spoken with in 11 days, never once been in Aldous Greer's pocket. She had been paying attention. She had been forming a map of the town, the way Bernard had taught her to form a map of a document. Understanding what connected to what before you decided what to do with any of it. She brought the books with her. She put them on Howard Quell's desk. She told him where she had found them and what was in them, speaking clearly and without drama, the way she spoke about everything. Howard Quell read for 2 hours. He did not speak while he was reading. Selah sat across from him and waited, which she was good at. When he looked up, his face had the expression of a man who has just understood the shape of something he has been looking at the wrong side of for years. "How did you find these?" he said. "I noticed the trunk," she said. "I went to look at it." "2 men went out there in July," he said. "I know. They said it wasn't worth the trouble." "They were wrong," she said, simply without judgment. Howard Quell looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at the books. "I know a county judge," he said. "A real one in the next county. A man who's had his eye on Greer for 3 years without being able to land on anything solid." He paused. "I'm going to need to take these to him." "I know," Selah said. "I made copies." She had spent the previous night doing exactly that, sitting at the table with Patsy Lorne's good paper and her own finest pen copying out every relevant entry in her clearest hand. Bookbinders were copyists too when the occasion called for it. She was very fast and very accurate. Howard Quell looked at the copies she slid across the desk. He looked at them for a moment in silence. "You did this last night," he said. "Yes." "All of this?" Bernard all said, "A document is only as safe as the number of copies that exist," she said. He said the first thing a dishonest man does when he finds an honest record is try to make it disappear. Howard Quell nodded slowly. He picked up the original 7th volume, Clement Rennick's journal, and he held it for a moment with the careful hands of a man who had spent his life handling important paper. "Who else knows you found these?" he said. "No one," she said. "Patsy Lorne knows I found a trunk in the bog. She doesn't know what was in it." "Keep it that way," he said. "For now, she did. What happened next did not happen quickly, and we think it is important that you understand that. Stories have a way of making justice look fast, of cutting from the discovery of the evidence to the moment the gavel falls, as if the middle part is not where most of the work lives. The middle part, in this case, took 4 months. Howard Quell traveled to the county seat. The judge there, his name was Everett Marsh, a lean and serious man who had been appointed by a governor who was, himself, serious about land fraud, read the documents and went very still in the way that serious men do when they have found what they were looking for. He requested the originals. He sent for a state investigator. He began the process of subpoenaing records. Aldous Greer continued to sit in his office with his silver watch chain. He continued to manage the school board. He gave a speech at the 4th of July celebration about the importance of property rights and the integrity of the public record. And Selah stood at the back of the crowd and listened to every word of it with the expression of someone reading a sentence they already know the ending of. She had by this point been hired. Howard Quell had asked her, in the 2nd week after she brought him the books, if she would be willing to help him reorganize his own filing system, which had gotten out of hand over the years, and which he now, with some urgency, needed to be in order. She said yes. He paid her $1 a day, which was not wealth but was enough, and which led to a conversation about whether she had ever considered learning the basics of notarization, which led to a second conversation about the county clerk's need for a records manager, which led in October to Selah Mourne sitting behind a desk in the county clerk's office with a title and a salary and access to every public land record in Hallow Creek. She found 3 more irregularities in the first 2 weeks. She documented them carefully, in the clear and precise hand Bernard Cray had spent 8 years training her to have, and she sent the documentation to Judge Everett Marsh through Howard Quell. In November, Aldous Greer was arrested. It was a Tuesday morning. The weather had turned, the way it does in November, cold and flat and serious. 2 men from the state investigator's office came to his door at 7 in the morning, before he had put on his watch chain, and the whole street saw it happen. Selah was not there. She was at her desk, transferring a deed record from a damaged ledger to a new one, doing the thing she had been hired to do. She heard about it from Patsy Lorne at supper. "They took Aldous Greer this morning," Patsy said. "Did you hear?" "I heard," Selah said. "They say it's land fraud. They say it goes back to the 70s. Patsy looked at her carefully. "They say someone found evidence. Someone found old records." Selah took a piece of bread from the basket in the center of the table. "Records have a way of lasting," she said. "That's the thing about them." The trial was in the spring. The charges covered 11 years of systematically falsified land valuations involving 9 parcels, 4 co-conspirators, and a total fraudulent sum that the state investigator put at $2,340, close enough to what Selah had estimated that she allowed herself, privately, a small feeling of satisfaction. Of the 4 co-conspirators named in the ledgers, 2 had since died. 1 had left the county in 1884 and could not be located. The 4th pleaded guilty in exchange for testimony. Aldous Greer was convicted on 7 counts. The families who had lost land in the original transfers, or their heirs, in the cases where the original parties were dead, were notified of the findings. Some of the land could not be returned. It had changed hands too many times. But the court ordered restitution where it was possible, and in 3 cases, the parcels were recovered and restored. Clement Rennick had no heirs. His property, the land itself, the house that was falling down at the edge of the bog, passed to the county. But Judge Everett Marsh, in a written opinion that Howard Quell read aloud to Selah in his office on a Wednesday afternoon, noted that the original preservation and discovery of the Rennick documents had been the result of individual observation, persistence, and skill, and that the public interest had been substantially served by those qualities. He did not name her in the opinion. He did not need to. Howard Quell knew who the judge was talking about. Selah knew. That was enough. There is a thing that happens in small towns when the balance of things shifts. It does not happen all at once. It happens in increments in the way people look at you, in the conversations that start and stop when you enter a room, and then, after a while, in the conversations that start when you enter a room. The boy on the fence post grew up to be someone who told the story, the woman who told the story, the woman who dragged the trunk through the mud. Not the version where she was ridiculous, but the version where she was right. The woman who had been hanging washing told her daughter about it. The man from the dry goods store stopped saying things loud enough for Selah to hear. Patsy Lorne asked her, in the winter after the trial, if she had ever thought about where she was going to live long-term. Not at the boarding house. Long-term. Selah said she hadn't had much time to think about it. Patsy said she had a sister who was looking to sell a small house on the east side of town. Nothing large, nothing fancy. 2 rooms and a good stove, and that she thought Selah might be the right kind of person for it, meaning the kind of person who took care of things and noticed when they needed attention. Selah bought the house. She planted a kitchen garden in the spring. She brought her satchel and her canvas bag and the bone-handled awl, which she hung on a nail above the desk where she did her work in the evenings. Binding ledgers, mostly, for Howard Quell's clients, for the county, for anyone who needed something made to last. She thought about Bernard Cray sometimes, sitting at that desk. She thought about the morning he had handed her the awl, not as a lesson, just as a transfer of a thing from one hand to another, the way you do when you know you are not going to need it anymore. She thought he would have found the whole story satisfying in the particular way that people who love records find justice satisfying. Not loud, not theatrical, just precise. The numbers had added up wrong for 11 years, and then someone had found the right ledger, and they added up correctly again. That was all it had taken. Someone patient enough to drag the trunk out of the mud. Someone who understood that a locked thing is not the same as an empty thing. And here is the question we want to leave you with tonight. the one we'll be thinking about long after this story ends. Has there ever been something in your own life, something others dismissed, something they told you wasn't worth your time, that turned out to be exactly worth it? We'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, you know where to find the next one.